My name is Joe Nagy, and I have a comment to make that you haven't really addressed some of the most important issues, but more importantly, you have to address the solution. The problem is you haven't mentioned the fact that all these buildings are going up in my suburb of Warringah and Hornsby, but what's happening to the railway stations, what's happening to the parking lots, what's happening to the roads? They're jam-packed. This is the infrastructure problem. It's great to build a city and chock-a-block full, but all that does is squeeze us in like sardines in a can. Now, the next point I want to make you, the solution to this I propose to both the Liberal government in federal parliament and to the state government. The solution is one word: decentralization. Now, it won't happen because our friends, I'm not going to mention his name, but you know Mr. Meriton, and you know the people that run Lend-Lease. They have a vested interest in this, and I can't see this ever going out the way they should go out. They should be decentralizing, building other suburbs and towns away from Sydney to take the pressure off. There's a lot more to it I just said. I'm aware of this, but that's where I think you should be focusing on the solution.
I think it's a really good question. BPN at this point in time doesn't have a perspective on decentralisation. We do have a perspective and platform in terms of sustainable population. And by that we don't mean that we don't want to have immigrants or we don't want to have refugees. That's definitely not the case, but what we're looking at is sustainable population. But I think there's a great opportunity going forward in terms of decentralising the population. We have, if you look at the New South Wales areas, more recently I was at a briefing by the Department of New South Wales, and I thought it was quite an informative briefing. It provided a lot of stats, a lot of pictures, and I actually said after that in a parliamentary inquiry that I think that this is the information that should be provided to all people, so that when you look at a district plan, when you prepare a regional plan, you actually know what some of the issues are, you know what the real issues are, you understand what the issues are, and right at the front end of that strategic planning process you're involved. Not afterwards, not when the plans have been done, but right at the start. And in that area, particularly in regional New South Wales, I think there's a movement at the moment for people to want to return to basics. Our younger generation has different values in terms of what they want to see. And if you look at those regional graphs in terms of the ageing population by 2036, you'll see that there's significant challenges where most of the 40% of the population in many areas will be over the age of 65. That means that those areas will be in decline because they won't be able to sustain their population. So in terms of actually looking at where we need to go, I think that there is an amazing opportunity to have a look at industry out in New South Wales in terms of renewables, in terms of incubators, in terms of education. Don't believe that education in 2036, 20 years from now, will be delivered the traditional way. You'll have MOOCs and you'll have degrees through MOOCs. MOOCs are where you actually do it online. You'll also have opportunities to actually move education institutions to the New South Wales region. And so what we now see is a city of a megapolises that we're told will evolve by the mid-21st century, where you'll actually have, a city of megapolis. That then brings with it more challenges in terms of affordable housing. But if you actually consider decentralisation, you consider what options you have, and at the moment you need high infrastructure costs. But going forward, you may not need the same high infrastructure costs in terms of transport, because the way we think, the way we work, the way we act, the way we live may be completely different. We may be having a 4-day working week, a high-powered working week. We may be living in regional communities where we keep our population there, where our kids want to stay there, they don't want to go to the big city, where the values have changed. And so I do think that what we're looking at is a significant change, and that we should be thinking about that conversation now, not following that conversation.
The way our economy is presently structured, there's an economic attraction and a gravity that you see in the centre of our biggest cities. And an extraordinary proportion of GDP growth in Australia has actually happened within about a 5 to 10 square kilometre radius of the patch in the centre of the city of Sydney. That's a reality. So there's an economic reality there that wealth is being concentrated in this tight ring around the centre of our biggest cities, and Sydney and Melbourne are the two areas. I mean, that's a fundamentally broken economic system that we're seeing this centralisation of wealth, this aggregation of wealth in a tiny hands. We actually need to break that economic system, because that economic system is really the key driver to this completely failing planning system that's responding to that aggregation of wealth in the centre of our cities. So, in many ways we say, well, you could fix these problems by just having better planning instruments. Well, when the entire economy is actually driving people to that centre, attracting wealth and development to that centre, it's pretty hard to fix it with a planning system. But of course, decentralisation is an excellent concept, and it's an excellent goal. But if you really want to deliver decentralisation, well, then we're going to have to find the economic capacity to deliver the infrastructure that links those decentralised parts of the state. I mean, Newcastle's got fabulous boats, amazing boats, terrific port, wonderful basic infrastructure. But the train line linking Sydney and Newcastle has actually got a slower service than it did 47 years ago, 50 years ago. And the same in Wollongong. Same in Wollongong. Well, yes, that's a different point. The same in Wollongong. The train service that links Wollongong and Sydney is slower now than it was in the 1930s. We've failed to invest in those core nation-building links that would allow us to successfully decentralise, because people do, and always will. Young people in particular want to be able to have access to these, extraordinarily diverse central parts of megacities. That's the truth. We need to ensure that access is there, and we can still have decentralisation. The government has the question on infrastructure. It was a really good question. The government has attempted to address that in its Greater Sydney Commission bill, and I'm not spruiking the government's line, but when they put forward the Greater Sydney Commission, they said, well, bugger off, democracy can bugger off. We're going to centralise with a bunch of experts, but they then said, well, we're going to ensure that when the Greater Sydney Commission meets and starts talking about planning targets, population targets and zoning, that there will be the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary of Transport, the sort of two chief bureaucrats of Treasury and Transport, will actually be sort of ex officio on the Greater Sydney Commission. They will be there when the decisions are being made. Now that's a sort of modest step forward, at least an acknowledgement that you can't just do planning without having the money and the infrastructure there to ensure that you don't get the developments that, it's not, you can really see it all around Hornsby and Waitara and the like in your part of the world. But the Greater Sydney Commission, whilst they're there at the meeting, there's nothing that actually empowers the Greater Sydney Commission or empowers the Secretary of Transport or Treasury to actually go and then deliver on providing the money or providing the transport links. There's a bigger conversation to be had about value capture and about ensuring that when a rezoning happens, the state government and taxpayers capture some of the uplift, and then turning that into a funding pool for local infrastructure. That'll expand my answer by another 5 minutes. But value capture is another thing we should be looking at.
My first issue is, I think there's been a steady and slow burn of a compromise of what used to be quality standards for urban planning. It used to be that urban areas were designed so that you're 20 minutes walk away from a station, from a church, from a museum, from a school, and now it's been thrown out the window. And to make matters worse, we have about 60 to 90,000 unoccupied units and 30,000 homeless people in Sydney. The second issue I want to address is, you talked about economic activity, particularly real estate development, being concentrated in a small area. Even Malcolm Turnbull said that real estate development has overtaken mining already as the lead economic sector. But we know historically that no economy can be sustained by a real estate boom. Sooner or later it's going to explode. And if it does explode, what is the usual remedy that governments propose? Austerity. We already have 30,000 people homeless, and we will propose austerity? Is that what we will do? Now, how would you address those two issues I've talked about, which is the deteriorating? Yes, I'd ask that question. Sorry, I'm asking the question already. How are we going to address the deteriorating standard, the compromise of the standards that we once had, and second, how do you prepare for a real estate bust when it happens?
We do have, we've moved from the mining boom into property. Property is literally our second biggest growth sector in Australia, and we're very reliant on property. And if we close that down or we shift it, we have a problem in terms of our economy. And so it's a complex issue. At the same time, we've also got, sorry, I need to look at my notes. We have a deteriorating standard of living, is your explanation. I think we've got a fairly interesting crisis coming up. There was a report done by Roy Green on behalf of one of the think tanks more recently in the last couple of years, and they talked about the knowledge industry and how if we keep focusing on industries that casualise our wages and also casualise our industries, that we are not going to be able to compete against the new emerging economies. And at that point in time, they talked about emerging economies such as Russia and Brazil and China. They've had setbacks, but that doesn't mean it's going to continue. And so we've got some fairly major structural problems in Australia, but as have many countries around the world. However, in Australia in particular, our taxes, whether we're surprised or not, are not relatively high when we compare them internationally. And we have a demographic that is ageing. And it's a substantial change where rather than 1 in 5 people will be over 65, 1 in 3 will. But then don't forget the other side, when you're coming out of the 21st century, you also have a declining ageing population. So at the moment, we're facing the baby boomers ageing. So there are very many complex issues. I'm not political. I look at all different policies. I don't vote for any particular party, but on a personal level, I can't speak for BPM, but on a personal level, I do think some of the policy initiatives that the Greens and Labor more interested, have as parties introduced are interesting. I think that our government needs to be bold and brave in order to bite the bullet going forward, and I think that needs structural reform. I mean, when the IMF says to you that it can't sustain the GDP or the neoliberalism economy can't be sustained forever, we've got major change that's needed. And in that major change, I think there's opportunity.
Well, I agree we should have governments looking at some economic fundamentals. We can't just sell each other coffee, insurance and real estate and pretend we have an economy. That is an
and tourism
failure. I'll give you some good news. The Greens bill, the Steel Industry Protection Bill, which is actually the bill that I presented, but my colleague John Kay, my former colleague John Kay, who was his brainchild, just passed the New South Wales Upper House, and we managed to get the Greens bill got the support of Labor, the Christian Democrats and the Shooters, and that said that all New South Wales infrastructure should use 90 to 100% Australian steel, accredited Australian steel, in all of our infrastructure, so that our public dollars goes into Australian jobs and the Australian industry, which pays taxes and payrolls and has environmental and industry standards. And that supports a regional economy, a core regional economy, and it's consistent with both decentralisation and, hopefully, having an economy that does something other than sell coffee and insurance and real estate to each other. We just passed the Upper House today. I was very good, actually. And when I was talking about the concentration of economic wealth and activity in the centre of the city, the real estate, the response in terms of the development of the real estate has been attracted by the concentration of wealth in the centre of our city. We're talking finance and law and marketing and insurance. That's generating what we call wealth in the centre of our cities, and that's attracting the development, which then generates more wealth for the property developers and the like. But it's not just property development that's centralising wealth. Our fundamental economic system is failing us and centralising that wealth. And the property development that comes after it is part of it and a response to it both. And we need to recognise that. We need to understand that you can't just put a map on the ground, say people should go and live in Newcastle, when the economy is just driving people in an unsustainable way to the centre of our city.
My appeal to everyone here is that I've been delivering the City Hub today with its article about the closing down of the Sydney College of the Arts, and you all saw this morning the Sydney Morning Herald with the major national art school facing closure. They're all going to be amalgamated under the University of New South Wales School of Design as part of the rationalisation of our education system. Well, the students out at Rozelle Hospital there off Cecily Street have been occupying for 4 days and 4 nights now, and we should at least get online and support them like we did the draft resistors back in the 70s when they were taking direct action to make a statement. So I'm just letting you know, the students haven't died yet. You know, you older people, give them an email or what's name support or letters to the editor, or hopefully the politicians can make a statement. Now, when I was living in rural New South Wales, if you wanted to be a high school teacher on a teacher's scholarship, you had to do 2 years out in the bush. All the teachers that I had at Candos High, 69 and 70, all came from Sydney, but they all had to do 2 years in the bush before they were allowed to go and teach back in the city. Now you might say that inexperienced teachers finished up in the bush, but that was part of decentralisation. All the 5,000 overseas Indian doctors that came here had to go and do 12 months in a locum out in the bush. We had Dr. Bansi from India, we had another Indian doctor from South Africa filling in from my father on locum when he was a local doctor. The point I'm making is decentralisation and regionalism won't happen unless we push it, and places like the Northern Rivers, they regard themselves as a separate economy from the rest of New South Wales, and so does Cairns and Townsville. They regard Brisbane as the Deep South, not Canberra. Now, I just want to know if either of the speakers have read the most recent edition of Arena magazine, which is available online and came out last week, because that has got a lot of stuff about the local and globalisation. Local fight back against globalisation at a local level for development, whether it be the City of London and Brexit and all that. There's a whole lot of regionalisms occurring in America and in Europe, and you know, smaller nations virtually emerging in the face of globalisation. Now, our economy is dictated by the multinationals. I'm going to wind up by saying, where's the Labor Party standing up last week and the trade union movement to 25% cheaper Korean manufacture of our next lot of trains? You know, what has happened to the Trades and Labor Council? Not even a strike or a mumble, just 1 or 2 words. They're the general things I wanted to throw at the panel. Thank you.
Well, we just put a steel procurement bill through the New South Wales upper house, which if we'd had 2 years ago, we'd have an extra 500 jobs down in Port Kembla at the steel industry. We would have a more vigorous steel and manufacturing industry in Australia, and we almost certainly would have had the component manufacturers who were part of the alleged cost disparity between Australian-built trains and Korean-built trains. They would have had a bigger market, more secure supply, and almost certainly we would have been able to put a more cost-effective bid together to get the trains. But I don't think we should end a government procurement policy at just steel for infrastructure. I think we should be having a government tax dollars should be spent on delivering jobs and economic growth and quality working conditions here in Australia.
As I said before, I think there's a lot of potential in terms of regionalism. I think that there is obviously a movement around the world that is rejecting some of the globalisation. I'll keep emphasising that I think that if the IMF comes out and starts to question core values like this or core movements, that you've got a major change. I'm disappointed that the Australian government isn't a leader, but rather is a follower. And I'd like to be able to see that we actually become, leaders as opposed to follow. That we actually have the dynamism, we have the education, we have the capacity. But politically, I think that we're very conservative, and I think that that's holding us back.
We don't have a planning system that responds to those kind of regional developments. I mean, there's a distinct Northern Rivers community that, is Lismore, through to Grafton, Lismore.
Casino.
Yeah, well, there's Grafton and Casino, but then there's also Lismore and Byron and Ballina. And you know, there's a very distinct sense of place. They want to have control over their own destiny. We've seen them respond with things like the No CSG campaign. We've seen them respond in almost a citizens' revolt to things like roadside drug testing, because quite a few people up there smoke cannabis and they don't think they should lose their licence because they had a joint 7 days ago. So there is a distinct regionalism. And even if you think in Sydney, I mean, it's not really a suburb by suburb or street by street. People identify from being southwest Sydney, or from, you know, you get the passport and you go to the Shire, or the northern beaches, or the North Shore, or the eastern suburbs, the inner west. There's a regionalism in our cities as well. But we don't have a planning system that empowers people on a regional level. I actually think we should be looking at aggregating councils, democratically elected councils being aggregated, and being given regional planning powers. That's the democratic way of doing regional planning, and it responds to that growing regionalism.
I don't think there's any hope of things getting better without a change in the culture. I feel as though things are moving in the world. When I look at America and think about Bernie Sanders and Jill Stein. People say Steen, but I know that it should be Stein because of my background. And even to some extent Jeremy Corbyn in England. But is there any sign of that kind of cultural change starting here?
I think there is signs of cultural change. Whether I like it or not, I don't know. I think on one side we have a very dynamic, inquiring community, and I see a ground force built up that's got the capacity through social media and also through connections to start to question, and I see that growing. But at the same time, I also see an undercurrent on the other side, completely dynamically opposed, who want to stop, hold us back, are very prejudiced and completely opposite. And I see that the end point is the frustration on both sides with government and the capacity of government to deliver. And I don't think politicians are all bad. I don't like demeaning politicians. But I think that we're stuck in structures. I mean, I think it was a very big recognition last week when Lucy Turnbull did come out, and she was obviously not aware of what was happening with WestConnex. And I think there was a particular disconnect there, and I see that in other areas. We took we took the secretary of the planning department and some of her executive team more recently on a bus tour. And we took them deliberately on a bus tour to show them what we thought was bad planning or what was good planning. And they sat for 4 hours, cocooned in a bus with us. There's only 11 of us. And it was a really worthwhile exercise, and I'm hoping to do that with other people. I felt that the secretary in particular had value from that. And it was interesting from my observation that I felt that she was perhaps the most person open to different perspectives, where the actual people reporting to her might be more timid. So I think there is a conversation that can be had. I think it's about talking, it's about connecting, it's about having the time, and it's actually about being bold and challenging people. But the way you challenge people, I think you have to be careful, because you want to have the conversation with people and you want to have everybody around the table. So I do see hope, and I think the more the community reacts, whether it's good or bad, is actually good, because it creates the tension, and by creating tension you actually do increase that capacity, and you do then become innovative and creative. I hate using those words normally, I've been using them for 10 years, but I think it's about creating tension in order to actually get a better result, and that's really important. That's what you guys are actually doing here when you have politics in the pub.
I don't think we've got any individual politician in Australia mapping out that sort of brave alternative that we see with Bernie Sanders in the United States. I don't think we do. And I think that we have an enormously conservative media in Australia, which makes it very hard and cows politicians when they try and put something innovative that breaks with this kind of managerial, which breaks with the kind of managerial approach to our economy and our society. I mean, in the New South Wales Parliament, I see a bunch of elected representatives who have actually given up on their capacity to change New South Wales for the better, as a general rule. They are there to manage an economy, that's what they think. They're there to manage an economy, and at best, they might tinker at the edges and produce some modest gradual change in due course that will have a marginal change on what they see as a juggernaut that they have no control over, which is a capitalist economy. And you know, in the debate we had today about, I think, a really modest proposal, which was tax dollars, when they're building public infrastructure, should buy Australian-made steel and support jobs, high-wage, high-quality jobs in Australia. We had a member of the government move an amendment to it. At one point, we had there's a steel industry advocate proposed to oversight to ensure that the rules aren't being broken and that actual Australian steel is being used in projects and the like. He proposed an amendment to change the name of the steel industry advocate to the steel industry commissar. And to sort of, to highlight what a radical communist, out of the left, crazy left-wing thing it would be that Australian tax dollars go to Australian jobs. I actually took a point of order to have it knocked out as there's arcane standing order that I relied upon to have it knocked out. But the one reason I wanted it knocked out was I thought I might be the only person in the chamber to vote for it. But we actually, that's what we should be doing. We should be challenging and proudly and boldly challenging this managerial approach, this idea that we're all disempowered, that we haven't got the capacity to drive fundamental change. Do you want to really fix planning in Sydney and New South Wales? We need to start by fixing the economic model. We need to start by redistributing wages, by ensuring that people have decent working conditions, by ensuring that we don't concentrate wealth in a tiny handful in the centre of our city and then gravitate all development and wealth and economic opportunity to that same. We actually need to break the economic model that's breaking us before it completely destroys our city. And we do need to say that more bravely. I put myself as one of those politicians who I don't think is saying this loudly or proudly enough.
My name is Kieran Howard, the Organising Committee for Politics in the Pub. I've got three closely related questions. Do you agree that the Baird government's unilateral support of a thoroughly politicised Planning Assessment Commission's approval of gambling tycoon Jamie Packer's Crown Casino project at Barangaroo amounts to the final surrender of the state's planning laws to the power of big money and the political influence that it buys? And is this casino Jamie Packer's phallic monstrosity an icon of the whole of private developers' greed over planning and good governance, of the complete surrender of the public interest to the rapacious greed of private profiteers? In like manner, do you think that Mike Baird's war on trees, the chainsaw attack and wood chipping of hundreds of century-old heritage trees along Allison Road and Anzac Parade, and his 1050 code allowing for the destruction of thousands of trees in order to enhance property values, and his biodiversity conservation bill designed to fast-track land clearance at the expense of biodiversity and environmental conservation, is this not also emblematic of a profit-driven, big property developers government, destructive of democratic planning, environmental, heritage and social sustainability?
In terms of the devastation that was done on Anzac Parade, I was one of the people that stood there night after night with my sign until I couldn't because my legs weren't working. And BPN has supported and coached, and I've told, and it's public knowledge, Saving Sydney's Trees, started the group with Saving Sydney's Trees, also with the help of TEC. So we have been out there, but in particular, I know as an individual, I've been standing there with the signage and proudly doing that with my orange and black on. So it's a very passionate cause. Those trees should never have come down. It's the cross width of that particular plan. It's a design problem. It shouldn't have happened. And the next thing is to have a public inquiry so that we don't have the same things happening again. Just to give you one aspect of what went wrong with the governance, and particularly planning governance on that, is that on the day that the second change, this is a major modification where the changes were made along Allison Road that took that whole row of trees out, the day that the public exhibition period closed, at 3 o'clock that afternoon on the Stock Exchange made the announcement that that deal had been done. In other words, the changes had already been signed off as part of the project. And that doesn't tell you that the whole process of public consultation is a total waste of time. What does? Yeah. And so in terms of that particular project, the reason that BPM was standing there wasn't just because of the trees, was actually because of the planning process. If we don't get the governance right on this particular project, which hasn't happened, on WestConnex, and then also now in Sydney Metro, and I can give you a whole story on that, which I won't bore you with, but it's horrible, then we have a major problem. We need to get the governance right in terms of our planning processes so that we have the capacity to get the outcomes that we need, rather than it just being done on the job. And there are major problems with that. So that's the first thing. In terms of the casino project, I totally support the action that's been undertaken at the moment by the Millers Point Fund. I don't know whether I've got the name right there. I think it's necessary. Interestingly enough, I do note something in terms of just sidelining on here on the PAC. In November 2014, that is 4 months before the state election last year, Mike Baird was actually at the launch of the Property Council of New South Wales. The Property Council. It might not be the Property Council, sorry, I think it's the Minerals Council of New South Wales launch. And their book on the launch actually incorporated not just property or mining or whatever, it has a whole series of items. But in those items, they actually want to get rid of PAC. And so while we don't see the value of PAC, it's interesting to note that they actually think that PAC is a total waste of time. So the changes going forward will be fairly major, because this is about not streamlining the process. This is about removing necessary controls. I mean, if you think that in the state government priorities that were announced last year and you don't know about them, so you have state government priorities now where 90% of housing development will be code accessible within 5 years, and major projects will be reduced by 50% in terms of their assessment time. Now, you've got problems already with your major projects, but we're going to cut them in half. And we're going to have departments within Cabinet that actually expedite those projects. So that's where your governance goes. So it's about economic outcomes, how fast you can get a project, and that's what causes your problems, okay?
On the terms of the Planning Assessment Commission approval of the last modification 874 on Barangaroo, which put the supersized casino and moved it forward and the like, the legal challenge on that is really quite fascinating. To the extent that legal challenges are fascinating. The Planning Assessment Commission, and it kind of proves just how rotten our planning system is. The Planning Assessment Commission said its only job is to look at the planning laws and to work out whether or not something should be approved or rejected, looking at the Environmental Planning Assessment Act and the LEP and the policies that fall under that, or in the case of Barangaroo, the major project approval that's there. But they said in the course of approving and finding a way to approve the casino, even though it breached all reasonable planning controls, and including the major project approval that's been given for Barangaroo, they eventually convinced themselves to approve it because they said, oh, well, look, do you know what? In an unrelated piece of legislation, the New South Wales Parliament has approved 2 casinos. And they've said a casino can happen here. So basically the Parliament has told us to approve this regardless. So even though it stinks on planning, we're still going to approve it. And that's, I might say, the basis of the legal challenge that's being run by the residents at Millers Point. And that's why I think they're in with a shot. The question will be how the political process responds to that. And I can tell you now, it's someone like Fred Nile, who voted for the steel procurement bill today, good on him. He voted, despite having an anti-gambling platform, he voted to allow a second casino. And he was duchessed by buggerlugs who came in and exerted the standard Sydney power on politicians and got what he wanted. So if we do knock it off, if the Millers Point residents do knock it off, it'll be a really fascinating moment to see if we can manage to cobble together a majority in the New South Wales Parliament to not approve it through some other crooked process under statute.
The question I was going to ask has been kind of answered in over various questions. So, you know, we understand the Runcorn culture is alive and well, but it's been entirely rationalised by an economic rationalist approach. And then, of course, reinforced, if you like, by the fear of politicians that they won't get re-elected if they do something that, you know, pushes people against them. So there's a whole cultural dynamic that's going on there that I think affects. And I mean, one of the questions I have is, why do you think politicians are so fearful? I mean, why are they, and I'm not just talking about the parties now, because there are crossbenchers who are each equally susceptible and fearful about that as well. Why are they so fearful? Why are we lacking in leadership? Where's it gone? You know, was it ever there? So that's one question. And the other is then in relation to the decentralisation. I've been going around New South Wales doing briefing for people who are interested in standing for local government in the, well, for those councils who do have an election, mainly in regional New South Wales, not in the metro area. And most of the processes about economic development are actually being imposed on them by state government, and they're significantly related to planning that's being imposed on them, whether or not that planning actually makes any sense in a local environment sense, and the councils are being marginalised. So even on that level, the flow, if you like, in terms of how the economic rationalist approach and the planning approach occurs is occurring. So the question is, what's happened to the leadership? And the other is, you know, why can't we redo at least the decentralisation leadership that would be better?
I see a lot of politicians actually that I come across, and perhaps this is because I'm an activist, who I actually admire. I admire David, for instance. I also admire people I've met in all walks of politics. But I also see when I walk into Parliament a culture, and I need to say this, which is white, male, and I don't think really across some of the issues. And I think that that's one of the inherent issues, is that you see a particular generation of politicians that may not be across it. I also feel that some of the politicians, for instance, may not actually be in tune with what's actually happening on the ground, and perhaps some perspective in terms of insights. I mean, I know that I'm a single mum. I also know I've been out of work. I also know that I've been on boards. So I've had a kind of completely dichotomy of circumstances. And I wonder whether at the end of the day, you know, talking about it, reading about it, or feeling it is quite different. I still do, however, respect politicians, because I think that's a really, really hard job. And I think that inherently most of them would have gone into politics because they wanted to do good. But I think that perhaps some of them haven't had the skills to do well. That's just my comment, and that's a personal comment. In terms of the regional areas, I attended a parliamentary inquiry last week on changes to the regional planning processes, and what I could see was a particular framework in terms of using development to stimulate economies. I walked out of there wondering whether the politicians around the table there were just on one particular track, and whether there was a diversity of views, and whether that would actually be fixed. So in other words, I think it's a much more intricate system than rather than introducing a new bill for the regional community. So what they were proposing, one of the questions we had to answer was, do you think there should be a separate planning bill for the regional communities? And I don't think it's about a planning system out there. It's actually far greater, the questions that need to be looked at. And I felt that the committee perhaps was missing some of that. So perhaps it's also about the agenda that's being set, and in order to change the outcomes, you actually need to be able to change the agenda and change that brief. I mean, we also know that if you frame something, you get a particular answer. And perhaps we need to go for a period. Again, I come back to, we should be at the head of the curve, not at the back of the curve. We shouldn't be talking about innovation and creativity 10 years after it was flavour of the month around the world. we really need to be on top of it. And in order to do that, we need to be bold and we need to have those conversations. Just coming back to a point that one of the gentlemen made before, where he asked, whether we can change things. I do think things are completely different now. That we have a capacity for social media and connections and education to actually change the conversations more than we've ever had before. It's really up to the people to find the interest in doing that. But it's like an old dichotomy. You only need a few very good connections in order to really change those conversations and get people up. So I think we are going through a new era in terms of public feedback, public thought. That also has a risk on one side and the other, whichever the political process is. But we do have a capacity to bypass media now that we've never had before. And I think the media's perspective going forward, that'll be fairly significantly changed, where communities create the debate, the public creates the debate, and then the media actually follows. Because you've actually look on the ground these days, the people are ahead of the media, and the people's thinking is ahead. When you look at any of those hot issues, whether it be planning issues or whatever, you've actually setting the agenda from the public, and I think that's a big change that's happening. And I think the media and the government underestimate that.
Look, I've said it, I think, at a previous Politics in the Pub, that we're actually seeing a transfer of power from the Parliament to the executive, and we're seeing it in all Western democracies, liberal democracies. The Parliament is being disempowered, the executive is being empowered, and with that comes a sort of disempowering of the parliamentarians themselves. They don't know how to regain power as elected representatives, and when you haven't started with a revolutionary institution in the first place, I mean, parliaments were designed to represent the interests of property owners. It's no wonder that we're not getting a huge amount of leadership out of our parliaments. I do think it's about trying to get enough. Well, part of the answer is trying to get some MPs to try and stand up and reimagine that they have power, and reimagine that the Parliament can actually change the laws and change some fundamentals. But that's not going to happen if you're just expecting a sort of outbreak of courage in the Parliament. Well, good luck to you. I think it is going to happen, as all good change happens, when parliaments are forced to become relevant again. They're forced to take some courageous stances. That's probably going to take a lot of hardship before we get there. But that's always been the way of change. If you're expecting a bunch of politicians to suddenly realise they should show courage and leadership and stand up for the community, just of their own volition, you're going to be waiting a long time. You've got to force the buggers to do things.
Yeah, Brian Concannon. My question also relates to the light rail project, and I've also protested that. It involves the destruction of a couple hundred trees, 66 Moreton Bay figs that were planted in commemoration to the Anzacs. I'm just wondering, what are the RSL New South Wales movement, did they put up any objection against it at all? And also during the protest, someone was saying that the light rail project is only a 5-year project, and then high rises are going to take place. What are your thoughts on that?
Just quickly.
Just to clarify, the actual number of trees that are lost is nearly 1,300. Of that, the trees that are impacted, so what I'm saying is that that's nearly 500, I think from memory, before they changed and saved a couple of trees or few trees. And you have to be careful because the media says they've saved it, but they were the ones that were already saved beforehand, okay? So there was about 586, if I remember. I can't quote the number now because it might have changed a little bit down, but they were actually the ones being removed or felled. Then on top of that, they had a whole bunch of trees that we cut back. And for instance, along Anzac Parade where the trees are left, they'll face major chopping because they've got to actually now take the buses off-road and the light rail. So before, the light rail was supposed to be replacing the buses, but it's not because they didn't have the capacity to take away that. So this whole project has been pretty much a mess. But it was controversial at the start. A couple of consortiums pulled out. It continues to be controversial, and the purpose of the project was supposedly to build the high-rise through there. But I think now, in reflection, it actually wasn't about that. That will still follow, but it doesn't actually have the capacity to solve that. Well, I think the capacity of the project was to build up and make the SCG and an IQ entertainment area into one. It is going to be the biggest or largest, one of the largest areas as an entertainment area. It is about developing the race course and making that into kind of a 24/7 entertainment area as well, just as Rose Hill will be done, okay? And so these are fundamental changes that, you know, we've got entertainment quarters coming through, and that's the reason you had that light rail introduced. It's I'm a very big proponent for light rail, love light rail, but this particular project and the numbers don't stack up.
As a Greens MP, you know, light rail is terrific, increased public transport is terrific, but the problem is we've got a coalition government with both its metro system, the metro rail line, which is largely privatising existing public rail lines, and with the light rail, actually putting forward what public transport infrastructure, not actually to produce viable public transport solutions. As Jeanette says, the light rail project's passenger capacity will be overwhelmed by the existing population there. But they put the light rail down and they put the metro down, not to provide improved or better public transport, or even long, but it's to justify this huge corridor of development. And that's what it's for. And no wonder people are angry.
My question regards Marrickville Light Industrial Area. There was a proposal a few years back to try and get the council to rezone it so it could all be turned basically into Meriton land. There was a couple of local property owners who were buying up large swathes of property around there. And I went to a couple of the initial community campaign meetings about that to try and stop that, because during the last 10 years or so, there's been a wonderful arts culture that's sprung up around sort of relatively affordable old industrial buildings and so on, artisan, all kinds of new businesses that sprung up, as well as some of the much needed around the inner city light industry, like metalworking and so on. So I haven't actually heard anything about that proposal. And of course, as from May, Marrickville Council was up before Marrickville Council before, no longer exists. So now with the Inner West Council, I was wondering if you would know of any recent developments with that, please.
No, I don't. But I actually think that part of the area, if I'm not wrong, is actually part of the Sydenham to Bankstown urban renewal area. And so I think that's actually being rezoned for residential and might be high-rise. I do know that when we were I took the department on a bus tour, when we're coming back along Princess Highway past Sydenham, I'd had a look at the map before, and we were talking about the challenge of building high-rise along major arterial roads because of the pollution. And the zoning was, or the proposal was, that they were actually going to upzone substantially along these major roads, so whether it be Canterbury Road or Princess Highway. And then behind that, it was actually a reduced density or the height limit, so you were actually putting your buildings along there. So I can't actually respond to you in detail about that, but I have a feeling it's part of that whole major rezoning application, where I think from memory, somebody told me this week there are about 5,000 individual properties that will be literally rezoned, which means that if you look at it and think about it, that, you know, the house here or the house there, you'll just see whole suburbs or whole sections of suburbs razed. And that does have an impact in terms of land value, gentrification, and also good design outcomes, because if you've travelled down Canterbury Road more recently and had a look at the initial high-rise that's gone through, it's a shocker.
I'd just like to say to Jeanette that I think the Better Planning Network has done a great job forming a network and providing a lot of people with a sort of platform in which they can start lobbying the government by providing, I know, all sorts of emails and pre-worded letters and things which make it easy for people to participate. But I am concerned about your statement that you're not political, because by the very act of what you're doing, it is political. And I'm also concerned about you also talking about politicians as if there's some sort of breed altogether mixed up. And I think, I really support what Dave's been saying as far as, you need to look at how we can get community input back into the process of planning. The Liberal government ideology is solely based on alienating public property and selling it off, which is why you've got the tapes and all the colleges being amalgamated and sold. You've got public land being turned into operational land. It all goes along with the ideology of the Liberals and neoliberalism. So you can't work in a vacuum. You can't pretend that we can get everyone to put little letters in and lobby, because unless you get rid of the power structure that exists, you cannot change it. So I think we need to look at supporting alternative parties, such as the Greens, and people who are more concerned with getting a consensual opinion on things, rather than doggedly sticking to the ideology of privatisation, selling off to overseas companies, monopolies of international companies. We are not going to return to a governance that reflects true democracy unless you challenge that structure. So I think the BTN needs to not say we're not political, because for a start, that would be productive. I think you need to acknowledge, such as David does, it all comes back to the power structure. It comes back to the planning laws being piecemeal, broken down, which we've seen with the state government. From the very beginning, they were very quick to jump in and change the planning laws. They quickly followed up with their biodiversity law changes, all the other changes that have alienated public input into any planning. So unless you see it in that picture, within that framework, it can't work in isolation, lobbying over one issue. So the question is, the question. So how do you think we can get the BPN to be more effective? And David, how do you think we can get people to be more aware that they need to be challenging the overall ideology of the power structure, rather than just everybody sort of thinking, well, we can't do much, we're all individuals. That's basically it at the moment.
Could you just say your name, please?
What's your name?
Susan.
Susan, I'm not sure. Did you have the opportunity to come to our forum on Tuesday this week?
Oh,
Did you have the opportunity to come to our forum on Tuesday at Parliament this week?
Where is it?
We had a forum at Parliament this week.
2 days ago.
2 days ago.
No, I didn't, okay. Sorry. No.
All right. At the forum, and I should correct myself, I didn't say I wasn't political, I meant the BPN. Our mandate, or our constitution, is that we're non-political. But we do raise the debate in terms of the public interest. If you had the opportunity to come on Tuesday at the forum at Parliament, I think you would have seen quite a different perspective. We invited many speakers from different perspectives, and one of them was Annie Yeatman in terms from the Whitlam Institute. And she really raised the conversation in terms of that we need to go past the civic engagement and talked about a people's movement. And I'm not suggesting that BPN is going to become that, but we're very interested in raising that public debate. And I think that at the moment that we are doing that quite effectively in terms of raising those bigger issues. So whilst I say that I'm not political because we don't have a leaning towards any party or whatever, we are out there raising the bigger issues and working within those confines. So I don't know if that gives you some reassurance or not.
It does, yes.
Okay.
Just quickly to go back on the question about Sydenham and Marrickville, that entire industrial area is captured by a potential priority precinct, which is the start of the Sydenham to Bankstown corridor, and they see it as a development opportunity, not as an important part of our city that allows for sort of low-cost occupation and arts and Red Rattler and a vibrant sort of mixed community. It's actually slated as a development opportunity as the first of that priority precinct. The question about planning and politics, I get so frustrated when I hear people say, this is not directed at Jeanette or the BPN, I don't think they do this, but I get so frustrated when I hear people say, we've got to take the politics out of planning. We've got to get, local politicians and politicians away from planning. We've got to take the politics out of it. There are a few more political decisions that are being made than the reshaping of our neighbourhoods and the reshaping of our cities. It is fundamentally political. We need to get the political structures right so that we're heard in the planning. And there is a disease going around that thinks that if people have captured this disease, they think if you just get the right experts to sit in a room and turn their mind to the problems of Sydney's planning, then the experts will come up with a solution for us. Well, they won't, because the experts are almost always bought and sold by the property industry and by powers that be. Politics is about, planning is fundamentally political. We need to get the right political structures in place so that we get heard in it.
Okay. Thank you very much, David and Jeanette.